Today we're talking about money, and it's fantastic to be at a SEDA event where our focus is on money. In all the conversations we've had with stakeholders, with you, money has consistently been raised as a key issue for delivering the just transition. How much do we need? Where is it coming from? How do we use it most effectively, but also fairly? And how can we move from a conversation about cost to one about value and investment in our better future? Let's remind ourselves what Scotland's Just Transition Commission said just last year in their report. Investment is essential to make the just transition real across every community and sector in Scotland. Scotland's just transition will not be funded by the current approach. If investment provision is to be left to the market alone, we will see an unjust transition. A different set of models, regulations, conditionalities and incentives is therefore urgently required, so that the public and private finance can combine to achieve long-term social and economic value that is shared with communities and workers. The figures associated with achieving a just transition may look daunting in the current fiscal context, but investment planning must also factor in the cost of failure. And short-term savings will be hugely costly to Scotland if these ultimately stymie sustainable economic development at this critical juncture. The investment will be made by companies as well as financial institutions, by government bodies and agencies, as well as by individuals and communities. From a just transition perspective, how this investment is delivered will be critical. Quality is important as quantity in terms of access to finance, the cost of capital, the geographic location, as well as the environmental and social performance of the investment. Furthermore, our financial industry will need to be transformed to help support the equitable delivery of climate targets and ensure sectoral and regional just transition plans are supported with investment.
I am the chair of Fuel Poverty Action Glasgow. So Fuel Poverty Action is a grassroots organisation founded in London in 2014, aiming to mitigate the worst effects and ultimately eliminate fuel poverty in Britain. Glasgow Hub was started in September last year. In that time, we have held a vigil for last year's winter's deaths, we have marched on Ofgem's offices, and we have held a protest outside the Scottish Power offices in Glasgow, which resulted in Ofgem delaying the granting of licences to forcibly install prepayment meters.
Fuel poverty is shameful, and it's shameful in the 5th richest country in the world. Homes should be warm and aspirational for people to succeed in life. So we want to bring that message to the table of the architects and people that are responsible for retrofitting or building homes for people to make sure that they're safe and clean environments to live in. I think first and foremost, pathological profiteering of energy companies needs to stop.
We need to fully invest in all sorts of preventative spend, whether it's preventative spend. So you're then meeting fewer challenges later on, and then you have more money to invest in all of the other things. A real understanding of preventative spend and how we can improve people's lives at all stages by ensuring that there are healthier, warmer homes, good education, social structures which help to support people's caring needs.
Always quite interesting what they're doing in other countries in terms of funding and supporting, like in Germany, France, and generally it is taxes, it's carbon taxes. And you look at Ireland have set up a sort of retrofit agency. They have slightly more public sector led model, but again that's funded by the public sector and it is funded through taxes.
Surely there's a long-term advantage or benefit, to taxing now, improving the housing stock and tackling the energy poverty, to then better health later. So is the taxing a kind of peak and then you see the benefit and reduce?
Glasgow and Britain at large has kind of fallen behind. It's all well and good to have people better able to afford their heating, but if the building that they're heating isn't fit for purpose, they are still wasting their money. that heat is still escaping out of single pane windows or improperly insulated walls and ceilings. And the big part of that, as I'm saying, is retrofitting. Making sure that the tenements which people live in right now are actually livable. And I think you've got to kind of weigh up the cost here. We're here to talk about money. It's a lot cheaper to upcycle a building than it is to knock it down and build a new one.
I've been campaigning for 20 years for VAT to be levelled across home building. I knew a senior member of the volume house building industry, and he said, well, if you did that, we would just change ourselves into volume house repairers. If we just change the way that money flows, industry will follow us. They will follow the money. We don't have to do everything ourselves. Buildings will be far more carefully evaluated and reused if people have to pay tax on knocking them down and get let-off tax in terms of reusing them.
Improving buildings is absolutely key to the just transition. For a starter, because it creates more jobs. For another kind of societal reason, that it reduces the burden on our infrastructure on the national grid. It will eliminate fuel poverty. It could also sequester emissions more than traditional construction can. It'll also bring equity to our communities, making sure that everyone can afford their homes and they can live in healthy, clean homes. And that kind of leads you on to the bigger point, which is that it can save the NHS a huge amount of money.
There's a report done by a group called GemSave, showing that to properly fund efforts to mitigate fuel poverty in England and Wales, up to the legal requirement, just to what is legally required of the government, cost about 18 billion. 18.1 billion is the amount projected by the New Economics Forum that the British government is giving to oil and gas extractors in tax relief just between 2023 and 2026. The money is absolutely there. It's not about whether we can afford this or not. It's about whether we want to. It's about whether we have a government in place that will actually put people's lives over growth, whether it's actually willing to invest in keeping its citizens alive.
It's that line on the triangle, isn't it? If you spend the money between carbon emissions and social impact, and we are the sixth richest country in the world, but we're the most unequal in Europe, and you spend that money and some people will take it to have a reasonable level of health by having higher temperatures and less mold in the home, and other people who are affluent will take the savings and cause more carbon emissions by flying off on more holidays. How can we take effective action? How can we invest wisely?
Hello everyone, so my name's Gemma Bone-Dodds. I am Director of Policy and Insight at the Scottish National Investment Bank. Who are the Scottish National Investment Bank? We are the Development Bank for Scotland. We exist to invest commercially in those things that are going to make Scotland better for everyone to live in. And so we have these three missions that had lots and lots of kind of public and stakeholder input in setting them. So the first one is to achieve a just transition to net zero by 2045. Second is our place mission, which is investing in places and regeneration to reduce inequalities, improve opportunities and outcomes for people and communities. And the third one is our innovation mission. So it's harnessing innovation to enable our people to thrive. So it's investing in things that will make healthier, more resilient, more productive sort of population. We invest in scaling businesses and projects that are meeting one of our three missions, and our missions are the first thing that we look at.
We don't have enough investment within the built environment, especially in comparison to the IT investment. In my view, the building which we have at the moment, they are hungry for energy. We need to invest in the right direction, right company, right idea, right process.
There is a funding gap in Scotland particularly, but there's oodles of capital. But we don't connect the idea or the plan or the innovation or whatever to the right capital, or getting the capital is difficult because it's sludgy. We can map capital flows just now, and we can look at why is money not reaching where it's intended. If you looked at the structural flows of or mapped a place, a project, whatever, and then looked at the stakeholder community that are connected either directly to it or at a macro level, and then you mapped the flows of capital, it would be very simple to be able to see, actually, this capital should be getting here, that's its intention, but it's not getting there. And by bringing the right people into the room physically, at a local level, and connecting and collaborating, co-creating and having all the voices of design in the room, the lived experience of the tenant, the people who don't normally get in the room, because it's usually people that have got the power that make decisions on behalf of others and do things to them.
I feel a lot of times one of the stumbling blocks in terms of focused delivery plans is outdated contractual models. I think it's how do we go beyond to create meaningful partnerships that go beyond this level of there's a pound sign at the end of it, and adding in, I guess, value-based procurement versus just bottom line procurement practices. It goes back to accountability, because we'll write brilliant things about, you know, how much social value we can deliver and how much environmental value we can deliver, but who's actually being tasked with that at the end of that? So where does that come out in a contract?
Is the existing economic system fine? Do we just need to make some tweaks? Is that all we need to do?
I don't think the premise of capitalism is evil. I think that it's being allowed to operate in a way that separates the most amount of wealth for the fewest amount of people. You can see it in terms of like financial outlook for young people now versus 50 years ago. I worry at the idea of like, okay, we have to change this, like bulldoze the whole thing, restart. I think likely the least amount of effort to get where we want to go involves like tweaking as opposed to scrapping.
In the 20th century, economics lost its purpose and started chasing the false goal of GDP growth. In recent decades, that has pushed many societies into deepening inequality, and it's pushing us all towards ecological collapse. This century calls for a new goal, meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. In other words, it's time to get into the donut, the sweet spot for humanity. But that's no easy task. Today, billions of people still fall short of their daily needs, from food, housing and energy to healthcare and education. And yet collectively, we've already overshot our pressure on some of Earth's most critical life support systems, driving climate change and the breakdown of biodiversity. What we do to this Earth in the next 50 years will shape the next 10,000. So let's replace that last century goal of endless growth with the goal of thriving in balance.
I don't think you'll ever get away from, certainly in the next 100, 200 years, you'll never get away from this capitalist ideal. It's not... It
has 200 years? We've got until 2045.
I just don't think it's practical. There are too many vested interests that will stop it from happening.
Economic man, with money in his hand, a calculator in his head, ego in his heart, and nature at his feet. He hates work, loves luxury, has insatiable wants, and knows the price of everything. But the trouble is this. On being told that he is like us, we actually become more like him. Researchers have discovered that the more that economic students study this Homo economicus, the more self-interested they become. Rational economic man is damaging our societies and the living world. We can no longer afford to gaze at his image, which is why it's time for a new portrait of humanity at the heart of economics. One which recognises that our brains are wired for empathy, cooperation and mutual aid. That instead of being fixed, our wants change as and when our values do. And far from being dominant over nature, we're deeply dependent upon her.
I mean, okay, I've got to put my climate science hat on here and say that capitalism has led to the situation we've got to in the first place. So, you know, how bad are things going to get before we have to do something about it?
For 200 years, industrial activity has been based on degenerative design. We take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while, and then toss it away. Take, make, use, lose. It's a one-way system that runs counter to the living world, and it's devouring the sources of its own sustenance. Economic theory has told us not to worry, that more growth is needed so that nations can afford to clean things up. But at the global scale, that's simply not true. And the effects are destroying Earth's life support systems on which we all fundamentally depend. We can't wait for growth to clean things up because it won't.
We might have growth in some areas, we might have degrowth in other areas, but ultimately we want to get to a point where quality of life goes up, where climate change is tackled. And that might mean a lot more community-based stuff. If we start from that point, then we can see how much capitalism we've got left.
We need to turn today's economies, which are degenerative by default, into ones that are regenerative by design. Ones that run on renewable energy, that turn waste from one process into food for the next, so that things are never used up, but are used again and again. And in all this, the 21st century economist's role is a crucial one: to harness the potential of business and finance, of the commons and the state, and of human nature, to unleash this regenerative future.
How comfortable are you as a group with the idea that suddenly we stop making profit? Or if we do make profit, profit isn't bad. Profit is fine. It's what you do with profit and where it goes. Money exists to be spent. It's as soon as money stops being spent, as soon as money starts to accumulate, that's when it ceases having a function. So how do we get money to flow so that everybody benefits from that, not just the people at the top?
There needs to be a wealth cap. As you're saying about people accumulating wealth, it's the people who keep hoarding it and not spending that are causing these issues. Literally just by placing a cap, no, you can't have more than this, forces them to spend anything above that so that it is continuing to flow. It keeps the economy moving.
My area is construction quality, and I'm continually driving for a better quality culture where people are doing the right thing because they want to, because they know it's the right thing. Yeah. But it's not, it's not a natural thing to do. It's not the way that the whole sector is set up. It's set up to make money. It's adversarial. It's all about disputes and suing each other, whereas it's unnecessary. We can do it right, and there are good examples of it being done right. Why is that not the norm?
The government puts some policies in place that benefit this horrible consumer society of building rubbish that doesn't last. That's absolutely on purpose. The general public end up paying for that, and the profit still gets left. So I don't understand why there's no consequences for that industry who have basically abused the lack of policy, knowingly that they built rubbish.
We need to stop this pathological capitalism, and that needs to start first.
Should money and power be pushed down to communities to spend money and make decisions on a local basis? The chances are that if communities are responsible for that, then economic change will come much, much quicker than waiting for a top-down approach.
We've got many opportunities to actually upgrade the financial and regulatory systems to address some of the things that we haven't been able to act on. Updating financial incentives and regulatory controls.
Redistribution of wealth. That didn't go down very well with some, but it went down quite well with others.
Should the money be focused on a whole-scale retrofit, or should we be focusing on clean energy? That's one of the queries that came up.
There's a quite regimented funding parameters, so money's there. Your project doesn't fit it, we're not going to fund it, the money's not getting spent to deliver the changes which need to happen.
There's not a recognition by the people granting the funding that these communities necessarily haven't had the resource to put together a very high quality application which will give them access to funding, and so these are often rejected without that recognition or understanding, and without feedback as well.
There should be a review of the Treasury Green Book that directs government investment to align it with just transition priorities and net zero legal duties.
And then finally, penalties for non-compliance. Make sure those who don't play fairly are penalised for their actions.
There was a lot of questions and optimism and some anger that came out of the groups, reasonably so, because of where we are right now. And I think that it's a very frustrating time to see, and I think speaking with people within this community, there is a lot of frustration because they say, on the one hand, I know what the solution is, I can see them, it's right there, and I know the money exists, and I talk to local authorities and they need to do these things, and I talk to capital providers and they like the projects, but we can't put those things together. So it's understandably frustrating. Like, how can we, without like a whole-scale change in the political economy in the next week or so, how can we change the system or move with the system in a way that is, to push it in what we would like to see? There are some models out there where either communities or government or other non-profits provide that pathway. If private markets were going to do it on their own, they would have. If equity markets were going to stimulate the transition, they would have by now. If bond markets were going to, they would have by now. But they haven't for various reasons. And we can talk about risk, return, or timelines for return of capital. But there are ways to do that. What I find optimism in is that we see people coming out of investment banking or the financial sector saying, I used to do this and I don't want to do this anymore. What I would like to do is to find a different way of doing it in a way that works for communities, in a way that makes the future the way I would like to see it in a just transition. If I want to end on an optimistic note, I think that's a good reason to, because there's a lot of smart people working on this. And I think that, in the last 9 months, last 2 years, there's been a lot of really fast work on this. And so perhaps we're approaching what is looking like closer to be a pathway. I'm not going to say solution, but